We remember Erik the Red as an explorer, a Viking adventurer who discovered new lands and built a thriving colony in the North Atlantic. We celebrate him as a founding father, a pioneer who carved civilization out of ice and rock. But that's not the truth. Erik the Red wasn't an explorer. He was a bankrupt, a man with no assets, no credit, and no options. And what he built in Greenland wasn't a colony. It was history's first leveraged real estate scam, a Ponzi scheme disguised as paradise. This is the story of how one desperate man turned a frozen wasteland into the medieval world's most successful marketing fraud, and how hundreds of families paid the ultimate price for believing his pitch. The year is 985. The coast of Iceland is crowded with ships. 25 vessels packed with families, livestock, tools, and seeds. 500 people preparing to sail west into the unknown. They've sold everything, liquidated their farms, converted their assets into portable goods. They're chasing a dream called Greenland, a land of green pastures and endless opportunity, a land where a man could claim as much property as he could work. But here's what they don't know. The man who sold them this dream, Erik Thorvaldsson, is a two-time convicted killer, an exile with zero credibility and massive debt to Viking society. And the land he's promised them is a lie. The balance sheet doesn't add up. It never did. And by the time these families discover the truth, 11 of those ships will be at the bottom of the Atlantic. The rest will be trapped in an economic prison they can never escape. Let's go back to where this scam really began. Norway around 960. Erik's father, Thorvald Asfaldsson, commits manslaughter. The punishment isn't jail time, it's economic exile. In Viking society, being declared an outlaw meant total asset forfeiture. You lost your land, you lost your trading rights, you lost your legal protection. Thorvald was bankrupt, so the family fled to Iceland, hoping to rebuild their capital from zero. Iceland in the 960s was a frontier economy. Settlers could still claim land if they worked it. Thorvald staked a claim on some marginal property in the northwest. It wasn't prime real estate. The soil was poor. The winters were brutal. But it was something, a chance to generate assets again. Erik grew up watching his father struggle to rebuild. He learned a critical lesson. In Viking society, your wealth was your identity. Land was currency. Livestock was capital. Honor was credit rating. Lose those things and you were nothing. Erik inherited his father's temper, but he also inherited his desperation. By the time Erik reached adulthood, Iceland's economy was changing. The good land was taken. Population density was increasing. Competition for resources was fierce. The frontier was closing. Erik married a woman named Thordhild. Her family had some property. Through marriage, Erik acquired assets. Not much, but enough to operate. He established a farm. He owned slaves, which were working capital in Viking terms. He was building his balance sheet. Then the first bankruptcy hit. Erik's slaves caused a landslide that damaged a neighbor's property. The neighbor, Valthjof, demanded compensation, but instead of going through legal channels, Valthjof's associate, Eyjolf the Foul, seized Erik's slaves and killed them. Think about what that means economically. Eyjolf just destroyed Erik's working capital. Slaves were assets. They generated labor value. They could be sold or traded. Killing them was the Viking equivalent of burning down someone's factory. Erik's response was predictable. He killed Eyjolf. He also killed a man named Holmgang Hrafen, probably an associate in the asset destruction. 2 men dead. Now Erik faced Viking bankruptcy court. The local assembly, called the Thing, found him guilty of manslaughter. The sentence was 3 years' exile from his district, partial asset forfeiture. He had to abandon his farm and move to islands off the coast. Limited trading rights. Restricted economic zone. Erik relocated to Oxney, islands in Breida Fjord. He tried to rebuild again. He borrowed some valuable timber beams from a man named Thorgest. Timber was scarce in Iceland. These beams represented significant capital. They were collateral. When Erik tried to collect the beams later, Thorgest refused to return them. This wasn't just an insult. It was theft of assets. A breach of contract. Erik did what any desperate debtor does when someone steals their collateral. He took it back by force. Thorgest pursued him. A fight erupted. Erik killed Thorgest and 2 of his sons. Now Erik's balance sheet was completely destroyed. He went back to the Thing for another trial. This time the sentence was absolute. Full exile from all of Iceland. Complete asset forfeiture. 3 years to liquidate everything and leave the island entirely. If he stayed, he was legally dead. Anyone could kill him without penalty. This is the moment Erik the Red became a scam artist. Because he had no options left, he couldn't return to Norway. His father's debt still hung over that territory. He couldn't stay in Iceland. His credit was destroyed. His assets were gone. His reputation was toxic. He was 30-something years old with a wife, children, and 0 liquidity. So Erik did what every desperate bankrupt does. He looked for a new market, a place where his old debts didn't matter, where his reputation hadn't arrived yet, where he could start fresh with a clean ledger. He remembered stories sailors told about land to the west. A Norwegian trader named Gunnbjorn Olsen had been blown off course decades earlier and reported seeing islands or coastline far beyond Iceland's western horizon. No one had bothered to explore it. The risk was too high, the return too uncertain. But for Erik, risk was irrelevant. He had nothing left to lose. In 982, Erik outfitted a ship. Where he got the capital is unclear, probably borrowed, probably on promises he had no way to keep. He assembled a crew of men as desperate as he was, men with damaged credit, men running from debts, men willing to gamble everything on a long-shot venture, and they sailed west into the Atlantic. Think about the economics of this voyage. Erik was essentially shorting his own life. If he found nothing, he was dead. If he found something, maybe he could rebuild. It was a binary bet, all or nothing. After days at sea, they spotted land, a massive island, bigger than Iceland. Erik sailed along the eastern coast first. What he found was economically worthless. Glaciers pouring into the sea, mountains buried in ice. No arable land, no timber, no resources, 0 asset value. But Erik didn't quit. He sailed around the southern tip and up the western coast, and there he found something different. The western fjords had patches of grass, small valleys where livestock could graze during summer, sheltered bays for fishing, seal populations for hunting. It wasn't good, but it was marginally survivable. Erik spent 3 years exploring this land, mapping the coastline, identifying the best settlement sites, calculating the carrying capacity of the land. And during those 3 years alone in that frozen wilderness, Erik had a realization. He realized that this land in its current state was worthless. The asset value was too low, the risk too high. No rational person would invest in it. But if he could rebrand it, if he could repackage the offering, if he could create the perception of value where none existed, then maybe he could attract capital. He could bring in investors. He could build something, even if that something was built on fraud. Erik understood the fundamental principle of real estate. Location, perception. The land itself doesn't change, but how you describe it changes everything. So Erik made a decision. He would commit the greatest real estate fraud in medieval history. He would rename this frozen wasteland. He would call it Greenland. Think about the genius of that name. It's not just a lie. It's a marketing strategy. It suggests fertility. It suggests opportunity. It suggests that the land is already productive, already valuable. It's the Viking equivalent of calling a swamp Paradise Estate or a desert Green Valley. It's aspirational branding designed to manipulate perception and drive investment. When Erik's 3-year exile ended, he returned to Iceland, and he began his pitch. Iceland in 985 was a distressed market. The population had grown beyond the land's carrying capacity. Farms were failing. Resources were scarce. Feuds were draining capital through constant violence and blood payments. Winters were getting harsher. The climate was shifting. Families were desperate for new opportunities, new assets, new territory. Erik walked into this market with a solution. He called it Greenland. He described fertile valleys, abundant grazing land, rich fishing grounds, endless opportunity. He said a man could claim as much land as he could work. No feuds, no overcrowding, no competition, just unlimited upside. He was offering leverage, the chance to multiply your assets, to go from small farmer to major landowner. All you had to do was liquidate your current holdings, invest in the voyage, and follow him west. The pitch worked. 25 ships prepared to sail. 500 people, entire families. They sold their farms. They converted everything into movable assets. Livestock, tools, seeds, cloth, iron. They were going all in on Erik's promise. They were leveraged to the maximum. Everything they owned was now tied to the success of Greenland. Think about the scale of that capital commitment. 25 ships, hundreds of animals, thousands of pounds of supplies. This was a massive investment, a speculative bubble based entirely on one man's testimony. One man who had already been convicted twice of murder. One man whose credit rating should have been 0, but people believed him because they were desperate, because they wanted to believe, because the promise of Greenland was better than the reality of Iceland. The fleet departed in summer 985. Almost immediately, the investment started going bad. The Atlantic Ocean is a ruthless auditor. Storms hit the fleet. Waves the size of buildings. Winds that ripped sails apart. Ships were scattered. Some were blown off course. Some took on water faster than crews could bail. Some simply vanished. 11 ships were lost at sea. That's 44% of the fleet. Hundreds of people drowned. Families torn apart. Assets sunk to the ocean floor. The maritime insurance industry didn't exist yet. There was no FDIC for Viking ventures. Those losses were total, permanent, unrecoverable. But the survivors had no choice. They'd already committed everything. They couldn't turn back. The ships that remained were damaged. The crews were depleted. Return was impossible. So they sailed on. And when they finally reached Greenland, when they entered the western fjords, they saw the truth. Greenland was not green. There were some patches of grass, yes, some marginal grazing land in sheltered valleys. But this was not the paradise Erik had described. This was a frozen, hostile, resource-poor wasteland. The growing season was maybe 3 months. The soil was thin and rocky. There were no trees for timber, no iron deposits for tools. No grain could grow here. This was survival land, subsistence land, not opportunity land. The settlers had been defrauded. The asset they'd invested everything in was worth a fraction of what they'd been promised. The balance sheet didn't balance. But what could they do? They had no recourse, no courts, no regulatory authority, no way to recover their investment. They were trapped, economically imprisoned in a land they couldn't escape. So they did what trapped debtors always do. They worked. They survived. They made the best of a catastrophic investment. Erik established the first settlement at Brattahlid. He claimed the best land for himself, the choicest fjord, the most sheltered valley. He positioned himself as the colony's founder and leader. He controlled the distribution of remaining assets. Other settlers spread out along the coast, each family claiming what they could, building turf houses, raising sheep and cattle, hunting seals, fishing. They created an economy, but it was an economy of scarcity, an economy where no one could accumulate surplus, where everyone was always one bad season away from starvation. The colony grew to about 5,000 people at its peak. 2 main settlements, eastern and western. They built churches. They established trade routes back to Norway. They even sent expeditions to North America. Erik's son, Leif Erikson, reached Vinland around the year 1000. But despite these achievements, the fundamental economics never improved. Greenland's balance sheet was always negative. The colony produced almost nothing of exportable value. Walrus ivory, seal skins, polar bear hides. These goods had some market value in Europe, but the trade was irregular. Ships came maybe once a year, sometimes less, and the colony depended entirely on imports for survival, timber for building and repairs, iron for tools and weapons, grain for food, luxury goods. Every one of these items had to be purchased with hard currency or trade goods. The terms of trade were terrible. Greenland was always paying premium prices for necessities, always operating at a deficit. The colony survived for nearly 500 years, but it never thrived. It never generated surplus wealth. It never paid off the original investment those first settlers made. By the 14th century, the debt came due. The climate shifted. The medieval warm period ended. The Little Ice Age began. Temperatures dropped. Sea ice expanded. The already short growing season shrank even further. Crops failed more frequently. Livestock died. The carrying capacity of the land decreased. At the same time, trade routes collapsed. The Black Death hit Europe in 1347. Norway, Greenland's primary trading partner, lost perhaps half its population. The Norwegian crown, already weak, lost interest in maintaining distant, unprofitable colonies. Ships stopped coming. The trade credit dried up. Greenland's sole export, walrus ivory, lost its market value. African elephant ivory became more accessible through Mediterranean trade routes. The price of walrus tusks crashed. Greenland's primary source of foreign exchange disappeared. The colony was insolvent. The western settlement was abandoned around 1360. We don't know exactly why. Archaeological evidence suggests the farms were left suddenly. Animals still in pens, tools left behind. Either the population starved, or they fled to the eastern settlement, or they were driven out by the expanding Thule Inuit population. The Thule had a competitive advantage. They were better adapted to Arctic conditions. They used superior technology, kayaks, dog sleds, toggle-headed harpoons. They could hunt efficiently in conditions that defeated the Norse. They weren't bound by European agricultural traditions. They were liquid, mobile, efficient. The Norse, by contrast, were illiquid, locked into farming, locked into European identity, locked into economic models that didn't work in the Arctic. The eastern settlement held on longer, but by the early 15th century it too was failing. The last recorded contact was a wedding in 1408. After that, silence. When European ships finally returned to Greenland in the late 1400s, they found the settlements abandoned, churches empty, farms in ruins, bodies frozen in Norse clothing. The colony had defaulted. The investment had gone to zero. Some historians estimate the Norse invested perhaps 15,000 person-years of labor into Greenland. 15,000 years of human effort, building farms, raising livestock, constructing churches, maintaining trade. And at the end, the return on that investment was total loss, zero recovery, complete bankruptcy. The land returned to the Inuit, who still live there today. Here's the final number that should haunt you. The Norse Greenland colony lasted 476 years. That's 20 generations. 20 generations of people living, working, struggling, and dying in a place their ancestors were tricked into settling. 20 generations paying the price for Erik the Red's real estate scam. Think about that generational debt. A man lies about a property. 500 people believe him, and their children and their children's children for nearly 5 centuries are trapped in the consequences of that original fraud. That's not just a con. That's a multi-generational Ponzi scheme. And the ledger was never balanced. The debt was never paid. The investment was never recovered. It was simply abandoned. Erik the Red himself died around 1003. He lived long enough to see his colony established, long enough to secure his reputation as founder and leader, long enough to profit from his lie. He never faced consequences for the fraud. He died wealthy by Greenland standards. He died respected. His son became famous for reaching America. His family became Greenland nobility. He won. But the people who believed him, the families who liquidated everything to follow him, the children born into a frozen trap they didn't choose, they lost. They paid the price for Erik's ambition. They worked their entire lives to service a debt that started with a lie. And history remembers him as an explorer. Today, Greenland is melting. Climate change is turning Erik's lie into truth. The ice is retreating. The land is actually becoming green. There are farms operating now in places that were frozen for centuries. The irony is almost unbearable. The scam is becoming real. 1,040 years too late. But the lesson remains. Sovereignty is solvency. Nations don't fall because they run out of soldiers. They fall because they run out of cash. Colonies don't collapse because of bad weather. They collapse because the balance sheet doesn't work. Erik the Red didn't discover Greenland. He sold it. He repackaged a worthless asset. He created artificial demand through marketing fraud. He convinced investors to go all in on a property that would never generate returns. And when the investment failed, he was already dead. The bag holders were left with nothing but frozen ground and broken promises. This is the real history they don't teach. The economic history, the ledger that determined everything. Because when you follow the money, when you audit the balance sheets, when you calculate the actual returns on investment, you see the truth. History isn't about heroes and exploration. It's about debt and deception. It's about who pays the price when the numbers don't add up. And in the case of Greenland, 500 people and their descendants for 20 generations paid the ultimate price for believing in a brand called Greenland. A brand created by a bankrupt killer who understood that in economics, perception is everything, and reality is negotiable. If you want to stay ahead of the curve, if you want to understand the real forces that shape history while others believe the myths, subscribe now. Because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming, who understood that behind every great exploration is a balance sheet. Behind every founding father is a desperate debtor. And behind every promised land is someone selling swampland as paradise. That someone was Erik the Red, and his greatest trick wasn't discovering Greenland. It was convincing the world he had.